Picture this. You're standing in a room that is almost too bright to feel real. Every surface around you gleams. Walls that should have been wood or plaster are instead solid marble, veined and cool and impossible. A ceiling that could have been simple is instead dripping with gold leaf and mythological scenes. The floor beneath your feet is polished so perfectly it reflects the chandeliers above you like a shallow pool. And then someone leans over and whispers in your ear, "This was just their summer house." For a second, your brain glitches. Because this is not a cottage, this is not a getaway. This is a palace pretending to be a vacation home, a private Versailles tucked on a windy Rhode Island cliff. And yet, for the Vanderbilts, this staggering monument of stone and gold was meant to be casual, just where you escape the city for a few weeks. But Marble House didn't just cost money. It cost something far more valuable. It cost a marriage. It exposed a war between old money and new money. It helped crack the armor of one of America's richest dynasties. And it quietly recorded, in stone, the moment the Gilded Age tipped from glittering triumph into something darker, more desperate, and doomed. This is the story of the Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. And by the time we're done here, I want you to feel like you've actually walked its halls, felt the cold marble under your fingertips, and watched the people who built it slowly realize what it was really costing them. Let's go back to where it started. Not in Newport, not on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, but on the decks of dirty steamships and the rails of American trains. The Vanderbilt story begins with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, a man who would probably have hated this marble palace we're talking about. He was not a man of gilded ceilings. He was a man of numbers, of engines, of speed. He started with a ferry boat in New York Harbor and built an empire of ships and then railroads. He understood power in a way that was simple and brutal. Control the routes, control the future. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had amassed a fortune that, adjusted for inflation, would make today's billionaires blink. He poured it into railroads, into control of the arteries of the country. But what he didn't spend much time on was something that would come to haunt his family later: social respectability. To the old families of New York, the Vanderbilts were new money. Worse than that, they were new money from transportation. Railroads and steamships were noisy, smoky, disruptive things. Very handy if you wanted to get somewhere. Less handy if you were trying to convince yourself you were a refined aristocrat descended from ancient European bloodlines. So when Cornelius died and left the bulk of his money to his son William Henry Vanderbilt, and then that wealth started to trickle down to the next generation, the old New York families watched carefully. Would this new dynasty know how to behave? Enter a young woman named Alva Smith. If you step into Marble House today, you're stepping into her mind, her tastes, her ambitions, her hunger. This is her stage. But when she was young, Alva was not a queen of anything. She was the daughter of a once comfortable Southern family ruined first by the Civil War and then by bad luck. Her father moved the family to New York hoping to rebuild their finances, but real wealth never came. What Alva did have, though, was sharp intelligence, looks, charm, and an absolutely unshakable refusal to be poor. She saw the social world of New York like a battlefield. On one side, the old money families, names like Astor, who traced their lineage as if it were a crown. On the other, the industrial titans, the new millionaires and soon-to-be billionaires, Carnegies, Rockefellers, and of course Vanderbilts. They had the money. They did not have the acceptance. Alva was ambitious enough to notice that this imbalance could be useful. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. William was rich, polite, and not particularly interested in social warfare. He liked horses, yachts, and a comfortable life. Alva, on the other hand, saw an opportunity. If she married into the Vanderbilts, she would gain a fortune, and the Vanderbilts would gain something they desperately needed: a social strategist who understood how to storm the gates of old New York. But the thing about marrying for strategy is that the bill always comes due later. For now, though, picture the young Mrs. Vanderbilt in New York, in a city transforming so quickly it must have felt like it was constantly rebooting itself. Factories, railroads, tenements on one side, and on the other, enormous mansions rising along Fifth Avenue. These were not homes, not in the cozy sense. They were announcements. They said, "We have arrived, we have more money than you, and we will show it to the world in a way no one can ignore." The old guard of New York society, led by Caroline Astor, had built an invisible wall. You could have all the money in the world, but if you weren't on the list, her list, you weren't really part of society, capital S. Your daughters wouldn't marry into the right families. You'd be rich, but you'd still be an outsider. Alva decided she was going to blow a hole in that wall. Her first weapon? Not Marble House. Not yet. Her first weapon was another mansion, a French chateau plopped onto Fifth Avenue dripping with ornament. She convinced William to build one of the most opulent city houses New York had ever seen. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it was strategic, because inside that mansion, she would host the ball that forced the old money to accept the Vanderbilts. This part feels almost like a social heist. Alva planned a costume ball so grand, so rumored, so outrageous that everyone in New York talked about it. Everyone wanted to go. Everyone expected to go. But Caroline Astor, the Queen of Old New York, had not yet formally called upon the Vanderbilts, which meant her name was not on the invitation list. Her daughter's friends' names were on that list, though. And suddenly, the old queen had a problem. If she wanted her daughter to attend the most important social event of the decade, she would have to recognize these upstart railroad people. In the end, Mrs. Astor made the call. Her card was left at the Vanderbilt door, and the invitations went out. At the ball itself, the Vanderbilts stunned everyone with theatrics, jewels, costumes. It was a coronation in everything but name. From that night, the Vanderbilts were no longer just rich. They were accepted. You'd think that would be the end of the story, right? You have the money, you have the social acceptance, fade to black, happy ending. But this is where the Marble House begins to loom in the distance like a beautiful, expensive storm cloud. Because once you've climbed a mountain like that, there's a question that doesn't go away. And now what? For Alva, now what looked like Newport, Rhode Island. Newport in the late 19th century wasn't the sleepy seaside town you might know today. It was the summer stage for America's richest families. New York summers were hot, dirty, and unhealthy. Newport promised sea breezes, space, and most importantly, a place to continue the social game away from the city's gaze. But Newport came with its own hierarchy. There were those who had been there first, who had built more modest summer cottages back when this was really a quiet enclave. And there were the newcomers, whose cottages were starting to look less like houses and more like European palaces. You can probably guess which category the Vanderbilts fell into. At first, they had a perfectly nice wooden summer cottage. It was large, comfortable, and for normal people, completely insane in scale. But for Alva, it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Not for the woman who had forced the Astors to bow. She needed something that would shock even Newport. So she decided to build a house that would outdo everyone. She didn't want a shingled cottage. She wanted Versailles. She hired one of the most important architects in America at the time, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had designed the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He understood grandeur. He also understood clients like Alva, clients who wanted to bring the language of European aristocracy onto American soil. The model she chose was the Petit Trianon, a small but exquisite palace on the grounds of Versailles associated with Marie Antoinette. Pause for a moment and just think about that. A woman from a ruined Southern family who had married into a new money clan that old New York considered vulgar was now building herself a marble fantasy. Based on the palace of a queen who had famously lost her head in a revolution against excess, there's an almost eerie foreshadowing there. Construction on Marble House began in 1888. It would take 4 years. During that time, money flowed out of the Vanderbilt accounts and into stone, into gold, into imported woods, into foreign artisans' hands at a rate that's staggering even by today's standards. Depending on how you adjust for inflation, Marble House cost something like $11 million at the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions now. Imagine spending the equivalent of a top-tier tech startup's valuation on a vacation house. Then remember that in these same years, ordinary workers in America were making maybe a few $100s a year, if they were lucky. The marble for the house came from multiple quarries, some from the United States, much from Europe. Shiploads of stone arrived, blocks hewn from mountains that had existed before human beings walked the earth, now being sliced and polished to form dining room walls. Inside, there are more than 500,000 cubic feet of marble. The name, Marble House, isn't poetic, it's literal. Dining room walls in yellow sienna marble, columns in pink Numidian marble, mantels cut in intricate shapes, surfaces so smooth they feel almost soft to the touch. The ceilings are high, coffered, painted, gilded. Chandeliers drip from above like upside-down forests of crystal. The grand staircase sweeps down in a curve designed for entrance-making. Every inch of the place seems to say not just, "We are rich," but "We intend to look like we were born royal." Now imagine being one of the people actually working to build this place. Not a Vanderbilt. A mason, a carpenter, a servant hired to clean. You'd be hauling blocks of stone, breathing fine dust into your lungs day after day. You'd lay floors that you could never afford to walk on as a guest. Maybe you'd look up at those ceilings and think about how much coal would need to be burned to heat this place in the winter, how many fires would have to be tended, how many hands it would take to keep this gleaming machine running. Because Marble House was not just a sculpture. It was a machine, a beast that needed feeding. Coal, wood, food, flowers, uniforms, wages. Behind every glittering party in that ballroom, there were dozens of people moving invisibly, doing laundry, scrubbing soot, polishing surfaces. Of course, that's the part the Vanderbilts didn't really have to think about. For them, the house was a statement, and the moment of its completion was stage-managed perfectly. In 1892, on Alva's 39th birthday, William presented Marble House to her as a gift. He gave her the deed. The title was in her name. A woman in that era owning such a property outright was unusual. On paper, it looked like extraordinary generosity. Look what he has built for her. Look what he has given her. But, depending on how you look at it, that deed was not just a gift, it was also a weapon. Because when you give someone a palace, you're not just giving them a house, you're also binding them to a certain image, a certain role, a certain life. You are, in a sense, building them a very beautiful cage. Imagine being Alva, standing in that dining room for the first time, the light catching the yellow marble like butter, her footsteps echoing on the stone. She has, finally, the kind of house that not even Mrs. Astor can ignore, a Versailles of her own, perched on American cliffs. She must have felt triumph, but she was also trapped, because the role she had carved out for herself, the social general, the queen of spectacle, required her to maintain not just one, but multiple enormous houses, wardrobes, staffs, appearances. If she slowed down, if she stopped dazzling, she risked sliding back into being that girl with no money. The Marble House symbolized the fact that there was no going back. The first years in Marble House were a blur of entertainments. Summer seasons in Newport were tightly choreographed. Breakfast, tennis, bathing, luncheons, teas, dinners, balls. Guests arriving under that carved stone portico, checking out who else was there, who'd been invited, who hadn't. Ballrooms like the one in Marble House were social stock exchanges. Alliances were formed there, marriages arranged, rivalries heightened. Alva used every inch of that house as ammunition in the ongoing battle for prestige. But behind the scenes, the story was less pretty. The Vanderbilt marriage was not a happy one. William was not a monster. By Gilded Age standards, he was almost mild, but he was also not faithful. Affairs were common among men of his class. Wives were expected to tolerate them as long as they were discreet. For a woman like Alva, who had built her entire identity on taking control, this was intolerable. She felt humiliated, disrespected. The house that was supposed to crown her triumph began to feel like proof that her husband thought he could buy her silence, her compliance. As she moved through those marble rooms, she would have heard gossip about him, about other women, about men snickering behind their cigars. She must have looked at the cold sheen of the stone and felt her temper harden to match it. At the same time, the world outside those walls was shifting. America in the 1890s was not a gentle place. The Gilded Age glittered at the top, but underneath, labor unrest was growing. Strikes shut down railroads. Coal miners risked their lives underground for a fraction of what it cost to light a single evening's worth of candles in Marble House. Newspapers ran stories criticizing the idle rich, mocking their dog shows, their diamond-studded gowns, their absurdly specialized servants. Ministers gave sermons about mansions like Marble House as symbols of moral decay. There were people who looked at that palace on the cliffs and felt not awe, but anger. And yet the Vanderbilts kept building. Marble House was just one in a chain. Elsewhere in Newport, another branch of the family would build the Breakers, even larger. Down in North Carolina, a younger Vanderbilt, George Washington Vanderbilt, was building Biltmore, a mansion so large it made Marble House look almost modest. It's easy from a distance to see where this was heading. A family that began with a man obsessed with efficiency and control, a man who invested in the infrastructure of a nation, had become a clan of people building palaces that could never, ever pay for themselves. Each new house, each new marble column was a withdrawal from a finite account, financially and psychologically. Inside Marble House, the emotional withdrawals were adding up too. Alva's resentment of her husband grew. She became more controlling, more stubborn. She enforced strict codes of behavior on her children. She micromanaged the staff. Many people who met her described her as formidable, intimidating, a woman who brooked no nonsense. You can almost see her stalking through the cold corridors of Marble House, trailing silk and fury, surrounded by beauty but restless. And eventually, she made a decision that, in that world, was almost unthinkable. She chose to leave. In 1895, Alva Vanderbilt did something that shocked the entire social universe she had fought so hard to join. She filed for divorce. Divorce among the elite did happen, but it was scandalous. It threatened not just personal reputations, but family alliances, financial arrangements, inheritances. For a woman, it usually meant social death. You'd be whispered about, excluded, pitied, or despised. But here was the thing. Alva knew where the bodies were buried. She possessed something incredibly powerful, knowledge of her husband's infidelities, combined with a public persona as a moral, somewhat severe guardian of family values. She used that. Publicly, she framed the divorce as a moral necessity. She would not tolerate adultery. Privately, of course, there were many layers. This was not just about affairs. It was about power, about control, about a woman who refused to be a decorative accessory, no matter how many palaces her husband handed her. And remember that deed? The Marble House had been given to her outright, in her name, as a birthday gift. Suddenly, that beautiful cage became a fortress. Because when the dust settled, Alva kept Marble House. In the division of property, the palace that had once been a symbol of William's generosity now stood as a monument to her independence and his loss. Imagine being William in those years, looking at what he had built, the insane amount of money poured into those walls, and realizing that it no longer even belonged to you. That the wife you had expected to tolerate your behavior had not only left, but walked away with one of the most valuable properties you owned. The financial hit was real, but the psychological hit was worse. For a dynasty like the Vanderbilts, reputations were capital. Divorces, especially messy ones, damaged that capital. Families that had reluctantly opened their doors to the railroad money might be a little more cautious now. Whispered stories about William's conduct, about Alva's temper, about Marble House itself, circulated like hairline cracks in the marble. Alva didn't retreat into mourning, not at all. Within a year, she married again, this time to Oliver Belmont, another wealthy man from another prominent family. Belmont also had a grand house in Newport Belcourt, built with the same mania for European styles. And this is one of those darkly funny details. For a time, Marble House, this massive palace she had fought for and won in the divorce, sat quiet while she spent more time at Belcourt with her new husband. A house this huge, this expensive, standing largely unused for portions of the year. Staff still needed, maintenance still required, costs still ticking like a meter in the background. If you zoom out, you start to see Marble House not just as a home, but as a symbol of how distorted the values of the Gilded Age had become. These were people so rich they could leave a palace sitting there like an oversized spare room. But there was another layer to this story, one that would give Marble House a second, unexpected life. After Oliver Belmont's death, Alva found a new cause: women's rights. It's almost jarring to imagine, but if you stood on the cliffs near Marble House in the 1910s, you might have seen something very different from the elegant carriages and gowns of the 1890s. You might have seen banners, signs, crowds. You might have seen, right there on the grounds of a mansion built to mimic the world of Marie Antoinette, a gathering of women demanding the right to vote. Alva used Marble House as a platform for suffrage events. She literally hung Votes for Women banners from a house originally designed to display quiet feminine obedience. She invited politicians, speakers, press. She turned the palace into a megaphone. It's one of the strangest twists in the story. This monument to personal vanity and social climbing became, in part, a tool in the fight for political rights. You can imagine the scene: a group of well-dressed women on the terrace, the Atlantic crashing behind them, the marble balustrades glowing in the sun, and a speaker at the front, voice ringing out against the stone, calling for equality. Servants peeking out from side doors. neighbors watching from their own lawns, some supportive, some scandalized. For Alva, this activism may have been partly about genuine conviction. She was, in many ways, ahead of her time in refusing to accept the roles prescribed to women of her class. But it was also, perhaps, a way of redirecting the same fierce energy that had once gone into social scheming and architectural one-upmanship. Instead of trying to impress Mrs. Astor, she was now trying to pressure Congress. Still, the costs of her earlier battles didn't disappear. The Vanderbilt family, as a whole, was beginning to feel strain. There's a saying about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea that a fortune made by one generation is often spent or scattered by the third. The Vanderbilts are one of the clearest examples of this. The Commodore had built the fortune through ruthless work. His son had doubled it, but also started the pattern of lavish spending. By the time it reached the grandchildren, the Marbles houses, the Breakers, the Biltmores, it was being converted into stone, into horse farms, into yachts, into art. To maintain those estates required enormous ongoing costs. And while the Vanderbilts were still rich, the world was changing. New laws, income taxes, economic downturns all began to nibble away at the edges of their wealth. Think about what it actually takes to run a house like Marble House. Dozens of servants, cooks, housemaids, butlers, footmen, coachmen, gardeners, laundresses, specialized staff for specific tasks, each of them with wages, uniforms, meals, coal and oil to heat and light the rooms, repairs. The ocean air isn't kind to stone or metal. Salt creeps into everything. Roofs leak, paint peels, fittings corrode. You can't just lock the door and leave. The house will rot around itself. Now multiply that by not just one house, but several, in multiple locations. New York, Newport, Long Island, maybe a place in Europe. What had been a symbol of leisure became, over time, a financial drain. The houses owned their owners as much as the other way around. As the 20th century rolled on, the Vanderbilts began to sell off properties. Some houses were demolished, some were carved into apartments, some sat decaying, too expensive to maintain, too sentimental to simply tear down, until time or taxes forced the issue. Marble House was not immune to this pattern. Eventually, it passed out of the family. It went through new owners, its rooms used differently, its significance shifting from private palace to historic site. But before we jump to the present, it's worth pausing inside the house itself for a bit longer. Because if you really want to understand the dark story of Marble House, you have to walk through it in your mind. Picture yourself entering the grand hall. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not just the temperature, though the stone does thieve warmth from your skin, but the emotional chill. It's impressive. It's meant to dazzle, and it does. But as your eyes adjust, you realize it doesn't feel particularly welcoming. This was a stage, not a living room. On the walls you'd have seen portraits, gilded frames around faces staring out at you with carefully composed expressions. These paintings weren't just art. They were branding. They told guests, this is who we are, who we claim to be. Cultured, refined, European in taste, even if not in blood. Step into the ballroom. It's huge, but strangely you can imagine it feeling too small when filled with hundreds of people. Music ricocheting off marble, voices bouncing, the air thick with perfume and cigar smoke. Women in gowns that weighed more than some of the servants. Men in crisp white tie, their stiff shirts digging into their necks. The conversations would sound trivial if you heard only a snippet. Dinner parties, horses, gossip. But underneath those words were calculations. Is that young heiress still unattached? Has that family's investments taken a hit? Who's rising? Who's falling? Step into the dining room. The table stretches, set with more cutlery than any sane person would need, each piece placed precisely. Above you, the ceiling is a riot of ornament. The walls gleam. Candles flicker in crystal holders. The food arrives in waves, more than most people in the country would see in months, all for one night. Imagine being a servant at that table, moving in the shadows between chair and sideboard, your hands steady, your body practiced, your face neutral. Maybe you grew up nearby, in a simpler house that smelled of damp and simple meals. Maybe your parents complained about the summer people. Maybe your wages help keep them afloat. Do you look at the marble and feel resentful? Or do you look at it and feel a strange pride that your hands help keep all this running? Now, imagine those rooms 10, 20, 50 years later. Fewer guests, fewer parties, dust gathering in corners, a crack in the plaster here, a stain on the stone there. Curtains slightly faded, the orchestra gone, the the silence louder. The life that Marble House was built to host had a short peak. The era of the grand Newport season, of competing palaces, of women in corseted gowns making their entrances down sweeping staircases, all of that was essentially over by the time World War I had reshaped the world. But the house remained. That's one of the eerie things about architecture at this scale. The people who built it, who argued in its rooms, who wept in private bedrooms, who schemed in hallways, and who clinked glasses in the ballroom, they are all gone. Yet the building stays, like a ghost that refuses to leave. As the decades passed, the Vanderbilt name itself changed in meaning. Where once it had instantly evoked raw power, eventually it became a kind of nostalgic symbol. The tragedies in later generations, the bankruptcies, the suicides, the scandals, blurred into a general story of how the mighty fell. Some descendants lived relatively ordinary lives, some tried to reinvent themselves. The fortune, once concentrated, was scattered among too many heirs and too many houses. There's a kind of irony in the fact that one of the most famous Vanderbilts of the 20th century, Gloria Vanderbilt, made her own money again through fashion and jeans, while giving interviews in which she calmly acknowledged that the original fortune was long gone. By then, Marble House was no longer a family home. It had been historicized, turned into something for people like you and me to tour, to gawk at, to interpret. If you go there now, and maybe you will, someday, you'll hear guides talk about the architecture, the designer, the famous guests. You'll hear about the suffrage rallies, about the parties, about the divorce. You might smile at the over-the-top decor or shake your head at the extravagance. But I want you, just for a moment, to stand there in your imagination and really feel what it represented. Because this isn't just a story about one house. It's about what happens to a family, to a class, to a whole society, when appearances become more important than substance. When a woman like Alva, who had real intelligence, real organizational skills, and later real political energy, spends the prime of her life directing the construction of marble dining rooms instead of building something more durable. When a man like William, heir to a fortune built on steel rails and steam, is reduced to a kind of walking checkbook, funding palaces that slowly slip out of his hands. When a family obsessed with proving they belong among the aristocracy of Europe forgets that their real power came from being radically, aggressively American in the first place. The dark story of Marble House is not that it was haunted, or that terrible deeds took place there behind closed doors. The darkness is quieter. It's in the way the house reveals how fragile even the most massive fortunes can be when they're poured into stone instead of into people, ideas, or adaptable investments. It's in the way the palace, meant to secure a dynasty's place at the top, ended up marking the moment that Dynasty began to slide down the other side of the hill. It's in the human cost of luxury at that scale, not just the workers who built it or the servants who staffed it, but the emotional cost to the people trapped inside its expectations, especially the women. Think about Alva again. She was undeniably a difficult personality, demanding, controlling. But imagine being born in an era where your intelligence and ambition had almost nowhere to go except into social strategy and home design. Give that kind of woman a near limitless budget and tell her that her job is to make her husband's name respectable, and you get Marble House. Later, when she found suffrage, you see a glimpse of what might have been if she'd lived in a time when women could run companies, lead parties, or hold office. Instead, we got this strange hybrid. A suffrage rally shouting, "Votes for women," in front of a building that couldn't have existed without a deeply unequal society. There's another image, too, that sticks. Imagine a stormy night on the Newport cliffs sometime in the early 1900s. The ocean is roaring, dark and restless. The sky is a low, heavy lid of cloud. Marble House rises up from the lawn, pale and reflective, its windows glowing with gas or electric light. Inside, a dinner party is underway. Laughter, clinking glass, the smell of roasted meats and expensive cigars. Outside, the wind tears at the shrubs, at the flags, at the very stone. Salt spray reaches farther inland than usual. Somewhere in town, in a boarding house or a small cottage, a maid or footman sleeps in a narrow bed, knowing they have to be up before dawn to set fires, to polish, to prepare. On nights like that, the palace feels almost like a ship, braced against the elements, containing a microcosm of the world, the powerful, the less powerful, the invisible. Fast forward again. Same cliff, different night, this time maybe in the 1930s. The lights in Marble House are fewer. Maybe a wing is closed off, staff has been cut, The parties are smaller, some rooms are rarely used. In New York, fortunes are vanishing in the market crash. In Europe, political clouds are gathering. The house stands, but the context has changed. The very things that once made it impressive now make it awkward. The country, in a time of depression, can't quite stomach quite so much conspicuous luxury. Taxes are higher. Maintaining such a property begins to look less like a badge of honor and more like a liability. For the Vanderbilts, Marble House, like many of their mansions, turned from a symbol of their power into a tangible reminder of their overreach. They had built too much, too fast, with too little thought for the long term. They had mistaken stone for security. Eventually, Marble House's fate followed the pattern of many great houses. It left private hands and became a kind of museum piece, preserved as an example of an era. And that's how most people encounter it now, as a relic. You buy a ticket, you walk through with a little audio guide or a docent, you marvel, you roll your eyes, you take your photos. Then you leave, maybe grabbing a coffee in town, and you go back to a world where billionaires build different kinds of palaces, glass towers, private jets, underground bunkers. The style has changed. The scale, in some ways, has not. But there's one last layer to this story. The title we're working with says that Marble House cost a dynasty. That sounds dramatic, but there's a truth there. Of course, no single house, no matter how expensive, single-handedly destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune. That took a combination of factors. Inheritance laws that sliced the wealth thinner with each generation, changing economic conditions, taxes, market crashes, and sheer relentless overspending on a whole ecosystem of luxuries. But Marble House symbolizes the moment when the family turned decisively from building the engines of America's wealth to building shrines to their own. It's the architectural version of a pivot from investment to consumption. Cornelius Vanderbilt built railroads that carried crops, steel, people, ideas. They generated new wealth. Alva and William poured wealth into stone that, in the end, would not generate much of anything except maintenance bills and guided tours. Along the way, what did the house extract from the people at its center? From William, a sense of control over his own fortune, a chunk of his public reputation, a property that would ultimately be used to fortify the independence of the woman leaving him. From Alva, decades of energy that might have been spent changing the world in other ways. A marriage that perhaps never had much of a chance once it became entangled with status anxiety and architectural one-upmanship. From their children, a childhood lived in the spotlight, with impossible standards and confusing lessons about what mattered most: money, appearance, or principle. And from the Vanderbilt name itself, a shift, subtle at first, from evoking awe to evoking a cautionary tale. Today, when people talk about the Vanderbilts, it's often in the context of, how did they lose it all? The Marble House is part of that answer, not because it bankrupted them by itself, but because it stands for a mindset that saw endless displays of wealth as both necessary and harmless. They were neither. So, if you ever find yourself walking up that drive, with the stone facade of Marble House rising ahead of you like a theatrical backdrop, remember this: you are not just going to see a fancy house. You are stepping into the echo chamber of an entire era's delusions about wealth, class, and permanence. Run your hand along the marble rail of the grand staircase and think about the men who carved it and the coal that powered the ships that brought it. Look up at the gilded ceilings and think about the social battles fought under them, the whispered insults, the forced smiles. Stand in the ballroom and try to hear the music, the rustle of silk, the scrape of shoes, and then listen harder, past that, for the quieter sounds. The drip of water somewhere in the walls, the creak of old wood beneath the marble shell, the slow settling of a house that has outlived its builders. Because in the end, that's the real dark twist in the story. The Vanderbilt dynasty built Marble House to prove they would last forever. But it's the house that survived. Not the fortune, not the lifestyle, not the illusion of invincibility. The marble endures. The gold leaf clings stubbornly to its moldings. The Atlantic still throws itself against the cliffs. And the people? They flicker through, some remembered in portraits, others forgotten entirely. Their greatest triumphs and worst humiliations now compressed into a plaque by the door or a paragraph in a guidebook. Marble House cost them money, yes. It cost them the equivalent of 100 lifetimes of ordinary work. But it also cost them something harder to measure: perspective. Somewhere along the line, the Vanderbilt story shifted from a tale of building to a tale of showing off, from creating value to staging it. That's what Marble House really marks. It's not just a Gilded Age palace. It's a warning, carved in stone, about what happens when a dynasty forgets what made it powerful in the first place and mistakes a palace for a future. And if you listen closely, walking those cold corridors in your mind, you might hear the house itself whispering that lesson in the faintest echo of footsteps on marble that once thought they'd never fade.